The voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene and you are listening to Brewed ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today in our ABC dialogue, we have a guest. He's now in Singapore, a lecturer in School of Rajaratnam. And he's going to share with us on the South China Sea. What are the issue and the updates currently on the conflict there. Welcome, Dr. Oh Isan.
Hi, good day to everybody. Nice to talk to you again, Arlene.
And to start off our conversation today, perhaps you can let us know what is actually the South China Sea and where exactly it is.
In fact, what is commonly known as the South China Sea disputes is basically there are various groups of islands or various what we call maritime features in and around South China Sea. And I think up to about 6 different parties are claiming these islands or maritime features. They are, for example, China, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and also Malaysia.
You're mentioning the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. Malaysia, for example, is definitely claiming the Spratly Islands, or at least a large part of it. China also obviously is claiming the most part of all these Paracel, Spratlys, and various other islands or maritime features. So over the past 2 years or so, we saw in the region, for example, China and Philippines, and China and Vietnam, there have been some small, shall we say, the armed conflicts around these islands, and so that in a sense destabilized the region a little bit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In the past, why the conflict in the South China Sea has not been that much tension compared to now, where China has been exerting its political power as well as its military power on the sea, and a lot of the recent conflict involving fishermen being barred, especially from the Philippines, to enter the South China Sea, and also there are cases where China's ships are mining minerals from under the sea.
Well, in previous times, obviously, when China is not as strong as it is now, very often when the other countries in the region, which also lay claim to the same islands and maritime features, China either did not or was not capable in putting up a stronger and more assertive stance. Now that China is well, in at least in their own view, economically more developed and with their national power more prominent and so on. So according to them, they are just legitimately defending their rights and so on. But of course, to a lot of neighbors, including Malaysia, including Vietnam, Philippines, and so on, we are not used to China being so assertive, or I may even use a slightly impolite term, pushy, in terms of dealing with fishermen, in terms of laying claims to various islands and so on. Yeah.
Why China Sea? There's a huge importance towards the South China Sea now. Why now? Like, what is the main benefits or gains that they can take from owning the South China Sea?
I think there are at least the 2 reasons, if not more, which prompted them to be slightly more assertive over the past few years. One of the reasons being, of course, now that they feel they do have the capability of doing so.
You mean the economic capability?
Yeah. Economic
and the
capability, and also the and of course the attendant military capability. Once you are rich, you can build a lot of ships and warships and so on. But also, I think China feels that they don't want to be encircled. I think there's a lot of conspiracy theories in China, which is very popular, saying that some neighboring countries, in conjunction with the United States especially, are trying to contain China, or at least encircle China and so on. And in many Chinese view, this will so-called constrain the further growth of China for them to resume their rightful place among the great powers of the world. And of course, I think there's also a third reason, namely the insatiable appetite for growth in China. You need a lot of raw materials, you need a lot of energy and so on. And beneath the seabed, there's a lot of natural gas as well as petroleum to be mined. So these are all the reasons.
Yeah, and China has been setting up oil rigs in area in which both in all the nations that you mentioned earlier lay claim. But why the I would say the natural resources interest for China is really important? Like how much China can benefit from the oil rig and other natural resources beneath the beneath the seabed, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's not so much that China immediately would need such a petroleum or such a like natural gas and so on. It's just that they need energy security. Namely, they want to have a constant and stable supply of fuel, of energy. Right now, China imports a lot of its petroleum and so on from the Middle East. And as we know, the Middle East sometimes, it could erupt into various conflicts. So also the transport of this fuel through high seas and oceans and so on, there are a lot of risks. For example, piracy and various other terrorist activities. So, well, this is a part of the world which is closer to Chinese shores, and accordingly, they will feel that this could be a huge energy reserve for them in this sense. Yeah.
Is the claims for the sovereignty of the South China Sea by China is justifiable because under the United Nations international law of the sea, it seems like the South China Sea has already been distributed in terms of the areas. Different countries have sovereignty in different areas of the South China Sea, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea were being agreed by, I think, all of the countries that were when it was formed in 2009. So, in your own opinion, do you think China has violated the United Nations Convention, and do you think China's justification that the South China Sea has been part and parcel of China since thousands of years ago, probably in the early century of China, is valid?
Well, you see, very often international law, it's a very dynamic process. And international law, unlike the normal law which applies to you and me, domestic law, for example, very often, you see, if you and I violated certain law, we will be punished and so on. Very often, for big countries, international law is something for them to shape, if not to be influenced. So in this case, for example, the spirit of UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, for example, the spirit of UNCLOS would preclude, for example, in my humble opinion, historical claims. So all these parties are to delineate the maritime territory, maritime sovereignty territory, under the various technical provisions of UNCLOS. However, China still insists that UNCLOS does not preclude historical claims. And as you pointed out, China's claims to all these territories in the South China Sea is mainly based on historical claims that hundreds of years ago it was under Chinese administration and so on. Yeah, China has a different view on international law than most of us do. China, I think, for many in China, they feel that international law is being manipulated by, for example, Western powers.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes, they I think they pick and choose which kind of international law they would like to abide by. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In that so, China also were very fiercely against having the U.S. being part of the, I guess, the mediator in the dispute. One of it, I think the U.S. at one time, probably a few months ago, suggested that they want to be the mediator, as in like to be part of in the formation of the code of conduct of the South China Sea. And it seems like the Chinese are not really happy with it. And in fact, would prefer to suggest either a bilateral negotiation and problem solving, or having ASEAN to be part of this negotiation and not involving the U.S.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, part of the reasons why I think China is being extremely assertive is because they feel that the U.S. Is trying to encircle or contain them together with some of these claimants. And let me even name these claimants, namely the Philippines and in particular Vietnam. So as such, China does not think the U.S. is an impartial mediator, and therefore they would not welcome U.S. Role in mediating this dispute.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you mentioned the U.S. proposal from I think about a month ago
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that all parties to the dispute in South China Sea, they revert to their previous position and do not perform new actions that would aggravate the situation and so on. China flatly rejected that. China also worked very hard to make sure that this proposal was not brought up during the recent meeting of the foreign ministers of ASEAN in.
But do you think the U.S. has their own agenda to exert on when they suggested to be part of the formation of the code of conduct and to be the mediator in the issue regarding on the South China Sea?
The United States has certainly at least one crucial interest. They do not like to have South China Sea being controlled by a single superpower, for example, being controlled by China. They are very sensitive about this so-called freedom of passage, namely both U.S. As well as other countries' merchant ships as well as military ships will be able to pass through South China Sea without hindrance. Imagine if China were to be allowed to lay claims to most, if not all, parts of South China Sea, then all U.S. Military ships passing through this region would be subject to Chinese sovereignty, and that for the United States is something which is unacceptable. As to whether the U.S. is trying to contain China, I don't have a direct proof of that. Yeah.
And that also explains why the U.S. And also the Philippines had signed a 10-year agreement and an extension of another 10-year agreement to have military presence in the Philippines. Would you think so the same way?
Well, the U.S. is definitely returning to the Philippines and having a de facto basis in the Philippines. Nowadays, new U.S. bases overseas, I think it's slightly different from before. Before, you have permanent bases. Namely, the U.S. will actually take a piece of your land and then they build a huge military base there. But nowadays, usually they do it on a so-called rotational basis. So the base in normal times still belong to that host country. And the U.S. may from time to time send some ships or some personnel to be stationed there and then move them away and replace them and so on. So it's a different concept, but the message is clear. The U.S. is here to stay in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
And another interesting development is about Vietnam. As we all know, Vietnam and the U.S., they are not the best of friends, especially international relations. But through the issue regarding on the South China Sea, it seems like they are being forced to sort of have mutual agreement, especially in terms of the sovereignty of the South China Sea should be belong to ASEAN. Do you think this dispute would actually sort of form or strengthen used to be soured relationship between Vietnam and the U.S.?
Well, the soured relationship between the United States and Vietnam was obviously due to the long and protracted Vietnam War. But I think U.S.-Vietnam relations actually warmed up since a long time ago, since at least I think about 20 years ago, in the mid-1990s, when U.S. and Vietnam re-established diplomatic relations. I think since that time, U.S. and Vietnam, they have been getting closer. I think there are, for example, U.S. ships which from time to time were stopped by Vietnam, I mean military ships and so on, and the Vietnamese don't really mind that. But yes, this Vietnamese dispute with China on South China Sea, it is actually pushing Vietnam a little bit closer to the United States. So it'll be very interesting to see how the regional dynamics play out. Yeah.
What did you foresee with Philippines and Vietnam being, I would say, supporters of the U.S. due to their soured relationship with China on the South China Sea? Do you see there would be a change in terms of the dynamic of international relations or regional relations within the ASEAN countries, and also the bigger superpower with China and the U.S.?
Well, the Philippines is a so-called treaty ally of the United States. Namely, the U.S. has a treaty obligation to come to Filipino aid in case of attack by other powers. So the U.S.-Filipino relations is an extremely close and strong one. The relation with Vietnam is close, but obviously it's not at the same level as that with the Philippines. But this sort of I would say shadow play between the United States and China in the region, it is in a sense dividing ASEAN.
Yeah, it seems so.
Yeah, it's very obvious that, for example, countries such as Cambodia and Laos, they are siding with China, and then the Philippines is siding with the U.S., and there are various other countries such as Malaysia, which are trying very hard to balance between these two superpowers. Yeah.
What about Singapore?
Singapore, just like Malaysia, I think is also trying very hard to
balance the power between both.
Balance. That's right.
Another third, I would say the third superpower would be India, which is interestingly next to Southeast Asia. What is India's stand on the issue regarding on the South China Sea? Does it affect the foreign policy of India?
I think India doesn't take a very strong stand on this because number one, it doesn't concern them, and number two, they have a lot of their own regional conflicts to resolve, such as that with Pakistan, for example. That's the most prominent one, and then border disputes with China is still ongoing. So it'll be interesting to see how the new government of Mr. Modi would conduct its foreign policy vis-a-vis China. Yeah.
Interesting. The reason why I raise India because apparently India's state-run Explorer Oil and Natural Gas Corporation said that its overseas investment arm has signed a 3-year agreement with Petro Vietnam, which is also interestingly being located at the South China Sea. So in a way, it's sort of have, I would say, indirect relationship with India's foreign policy or economic interests in a way.
Yeah, certainly. But that kind of joint venture relations, I don't know how long it can last because I don't even know if India has really the technical capability to extract petroleum and natural gas from that part of the seabed. So I still think India is not an active player.
Mm-hmm.
India, in fact, is not even an active player in Southeast Asian sort of regional dynamics at all. You see, for example, we are discussing usually about U.S. versus China. Nobody is seriously talking about China versus India in terms of Southeast Asia.
It seems like it's a totally different ball game and different foreign policy altogether.
Yeah, India simply, despite being a nuclear power, India simply doesn't have the national, overall national clout of power to play this sort of what I would call big game, like those being played between U.S. and China. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another point that I want to raise, I'm glad that you mentioned ASEAN earlier, and you mentioned how countries within Southeast Asia has been very divided in terms of their view on the South China Sea, and interestingly as well, during the ASEAN summit, there's no strong press statement or statement against China on their military power in the South China Sea. Then the most that the ASEAN leaders has given is their expression of serious concern over the tension, calling for self-restraint and peaceful acts from both sides. But they haven't been really negotiating with China as an entity to sort of seek a solution on the matter. Why is that so? Why ASEAN has not been united in this issue?
Well, obviously because ASEAN works on a consensus basis. So any one ASEAN member country objecting to it, you would derail your whole policy, especially foreign policy. And of course, in this part of the world, we know that, for example, Cambodia and Laos are good friends of China. And of course, they would not like ASEAN to take a collective stance because that is against China's stand, namely that bilateral negotiation and so on is the way to resolve all these disputes. A lot of smaller countries have problem with bilateral negotiations with China because it's an unequal negotiation. China has been so powerful, and these Southeast Asian small nations in Southeast Asia, they feel that they might be shortchanged in the process. So for them, they would like to have collective negotiation. So I think a compromise could be struck in the sense of at least at this point, reaching some sort of progress in the drafting of the so-called COC, the Code of Conduct on South China Seas, which China also vowed to take part. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We'll take a short break and we will discuss more later on. Stay tuned.
The voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene, and we are continuing our discussion with Dr. Oh Isan, a lecturer and also someone who is an expert in Southeast Asia from the Rajaratnam School in Singapore. And so, continuing our discussion related to ASEAN, Another interesting development coming out from Indonesia. Actually, recently, it was a favor given by Jokowi. He said that Indonesia will be keen to lead the way in terms of being the mediator to solve the issues on the South China Sea. And what do you think of having Indonesia as somewhat a country that is from Southeast Asia, that has neutral position in terms of their relationship? In terms of its relationship with China and Indonesia and the US. Do you think this would be a good way forward in terms of getting ASEAN out of the issues and dispute with China regarding on the South China Sea?
It would have been the case that Indonesia, as a non-claimant party to the South China Sea dispute, could be an effective and acceptable and neutral mediator between China on the one hand and many of the other claimant countries on the other hand. Unfortunately, I think, if I remember correctly, there were maps published by China since last year, and in this map, the so-called 9 dash lines, that is China's maritime sovereignty claims, the lines which delineate those claims. I think some of those lines, if you compare it with maps published by Indonesia, I think there's some overlap between the 9 dash lines and Indonesia's some of its sea lines, sea border lines. So in that sense, even though China and Indonesia, both parties did not raise it yet, but potentially Indonesia could also become a claimant country and thereby not being a so-called neutral mediator. But if Indonesia doesn't make those claims, then yeah, this could be like the first diplomatic gesture by the new Jokowi government. Yeah. Indeed.
If, let's say, Indonesia never make the claim, they would accept that, hey, we do not want to be part of the country that claim the disputed area. Do you think, how far do you think Indonesia can play its role, and how China will receive Indonesia response as the mediator?
Well, what Indonesia would then be offering would be what in international diplomatic terms are called the good office. The good office, namely, you provide the venue, you provide some facilities, and perhaps your president will come out and say a few words and try to bring the various parties together. But if you really ask me whether I think such talks would be effective, would be efficient in solving some of these issues, yes, perhaps a little bit, but not much, because the underlying dispute is still there. No matter you negotiate for how long, it's very difficult to have a clear-cut solution to a certain piece of land or sea territory, which is claimed by sometimes up to 4 or 5 different countries. I mean, how are you, country A and country B, going to sit down and talk about dividing up a piece of sea territory?
Well, what about going back to the What about going back to the United Nations Convention? Just revisit it back.
Well, you could do that, but the UNCLOS only gives a very technical guidance, such as how many miles, how many kilometers from your shoreline you could claim as your sovereign territory, and then exclusive economic zones, and so on. And China has a reluctance to go to the International Maritime Tribunal. They just don't like going to all these international
and
courts.
They don't even believe in such
that's right.
tribunal, considering to them is Western centric. But to ASEAN,
Western centric indeed.
But to ASEAN, I think there's a lot of saying among ASEAN countries we need to be united, because
that's right.
2015 and beyond, we are going to be an ASEAN community, but it seems like the politics of Southeast Asian countries is very divided. Some are very pro the US, some are very pro China, some are quite neutral in their stance. But it seems like there's no uniting voice that can somehow create, I would say, stability within ASEAN when it comes to like security or international relations with other countries outside of ASEAN. How can we create this uniting force within this country?
Well, Indonesia, as the largest and most populous and the most prosperous Southeast Asian nation, so ASEAN member state, would have to, of course, take the lead in doing so. We have, even though ASEAN among itself, we don't usually have a common stand, but we actually have been quite useful in terms of being the center of a lot of security infrastructure in the region. We are talking about, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum. We are talking about the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting plus other countries. We are talking about the various ASEAN pluses and so on. So we just have to consolidate. We need to balance very carefully between, on the one hand, that we are unable to reach a consensus among ourselves, and on the other hand, still play an effective role in terms of diffusing regional conflicts and such disputes here.
So in your own opinion, when it comes to ASEAN, do you think by having a much more clearer idea of what is the economic interest of ASEAN, it can possibly be somehow a good foundation for ASEAN countries to realize, at the end of the day, this sort of dispute will not give any advantage to any of the member of the ASEAN state, regardless whether they are pro the US or pro China. So how can it play towards ASEAN?
Economically, we are getting integrated, definitely. For example, next year we will be having this ASEAN Economic Community, and the tariff rates for most of our goods will be drastically reduced, if not becoming zero. So in theory, for example, you set up a factory in Indonesia, you produce the goods, when you bring them into Malaysia, you don't pay any tariff, right? So the hope is, of course, with this economic integration, slowly but surely, the people of ASEAN would come to integrate even deeper, and thereby they will have a common stance later in terms of foreign policy and so on. But it's a long process. I think just the economic integration part will take quite a few years.
Let's say South China Sea eventually fell under the sovereignty of China. How would it affect Southeast Asia economically? Would it affect just individual countries or ASEAN as a whole?
Well, first of all, I think it's extremely unlikely to have the whole of South China Sea being under Chinese sovereignty. But number two, if that is to happen, I think a lot of Southeast Asian nations will feel very uncomfortable, because essentially you have Chinese sea territories almost right to your front door. And a lot of people still see China as being as being quite opaque. Very often we don't know what actually is going on in China. So with such a big power being so close to you, and you don't know what really is their intention and so on, a lot of countries will get very nervous. When you get very nervous, you tend to not do a lot of business.
Would this escalate into a militarization of Southeast Asia and China?
Well, it is already doing so. China is building various weaponries at an extremely fast speed. They are building up their warships. They're building up their various other military type ships, even though they are naming it as maritime enforcement and fishery enforcement ships and so on. Similarly, you see the Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, they are also acquiring new weaponries, such as boats and ships and so on, from various different parties, even from Japan nowadays. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And will this somehow tear apart ASEAN?
Well, you may say so, but so far those countries which are pro-China, frankly speaking, they are not the most prominent countries in ASEAN.
Mm-hmm.
So I think ASEAN, even if those countries leave ASEAN, I think ASEAN could survive just with its core. The core of ASEAN, namely, for example, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, the Philippines, and several other countries, I think that would remain quite intact here.
Mm-hmm. So, with all this is currently happening now, and there's a lot of superpower interest, having interest in this particular area in South China Sea, and it seems like countries are divided within ASEAN whether to support China, or to support the US, or to stay neutral. So, what is the best way forward? As in, like, how can we contain the dispute to the most minimum damage that it can be, rather than become an escalation of war or militarization that is happening right now?
I think it's extremely imperial that we speed up the process of negotiation and drafting of the code of conduct, because the code of conduct on South China Sea does not touch upon sovereignty and various other such sensitive issues. It simply lays down rules as to, for example, when two different types of ships from two different countries, when they encounter each other, what should be the protocol for them to deal with each other, to contact each other, and so on. So all these issues can minimize misunderstanding, and thereby also minimize possibility of armed conflicts. I think we should really speed that up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, should the US be part of the drafting of the code of conduct, or be a mediator, or should it be solely between ASEAN and China?
Well, China will of course like to keep the US out of it, but we have to be realistic. The United States, whether we like it or not, is the world's essentially law enforcer. So, and especially in this part of the world where there are a lot of pirates, where there are a lot of issues which only the U.S. Could forcefully, powerfully, and effectively conduct. So I'm not of the opinion that this code of conduct could be meaningful without U.S. participation.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your view, Dr. Oisan.
Well, thank you very much indeed.